in our lives, we end up going through a process in relationship. We all end up making boundaries. These are limits. These are things that we want or don't want. These are in a sense as I'm not going to let you slap me. I'm not going to let you hurt me. Or the boundary might be, I have consented to marry you, and I will live within the commitments of that relationship. So you make a boundary. And what happens after you set a limit? What happens? Any idea? Somebody breaks the boundary. That's generally what will happen. Conflict. Let me put it this way. How many of you here are sheep herders? Are there any sheep herders here today? Oh, you're no. Just raise your hand. When you take sheep and you put them in a new pen that they've never been in, if this was a pen and you put them in a field that they've never been in, where do the sheep eat first? They always eat at the fence line. They always test the boundaries. You find this with a lot of animals. And if you don't have boundaries and you set some, they will be sure to be tested. So when you set a boundary or a limit, there is conflict. Conflict will happen. When God sets boundaries or limits with us, we test them, don't we? We try not to, but we do test them. Then, after the conflict, now I'm talking what's going on inside of you. You set a boundary or a limit. It might be a commitment. Commitment is a limit, or boundary. And a conflict has resulted. Then what do you need to do before you can go any further? You need to release, again we're here, release the offense. This is a thing that's done on the inside of your heart and soul that ends up saying, I am going to be willing to address the subject. It means going beyond the offense and resting or sitting in the offense. Because what often happens is there's been an offense and then we go, okay, now I'm just going to sit right here. We just kind of sit there. We don't move on and they don't move on and nothing happens. And we need to get to a point to release the offense. Notice I am not saying we need to get to a point to let the relationship be what it was before. We're not anywhere near that. We get to the point of releasing the offense so that we can begin to address the pain. We often do not forgive or release the offense because the pain is so big. Often the greatest pain we face is the fact that, hey, I was wrong about this person. This person changed, or I have changed, and this person wasn't the person I thought they were. And it's one thing to face someone else's failings. It's another thing to face your own failings. So you see in here is you often not only need to forgive others, but you need to forgive whom? Yeah. So then you release the offense. What do you do then? You begin to define the relationship. You define what the relationship will be, not what you want it to be. If I really like Dave, and I do, and I want to be with him a lot, yet I say, well, let's go out to dinner tonight, and he says, fine, and then I get there and he never shows up. So then fine, I release the offense, and I do it, and then I'll say, talk to him, he says, sorry, I had something. So then we set it up for Wednesday, he doesn't show up. Thursday, he doesn't show up. Saturday, he doesn't show up. What I'm doing there is defining the relationship by what I hope it would be. This is somebody I really want to have lunch with all the time. Instead of realizing, this dude's not going to show up. Or else he's always going to have an excuse, and he's never done this. So we define what the relationship, we've never gone out to lunch or dinner. So instead of we define what the relationship will be, or is. And what does that lead to? To boundaries, which can lead to conflict, which again goes back into that circle. I I call this, when I like to think of biblical words, I like to call boundaries principles, or the laws of Christ. This I often call sin. This is just, I don't want you to get stuck on the theological terms I'm using here. This I call forgiveness. What do you think I call this, defining the relationship? What? Knowledge? Nope. Reconciliation. See, notice earlier when I talked about, I said the word reconciliation and then I changed it to restoring the marriage. One of the things about reconciliation is often an accounting term that means what? To count up, to see what is there. It's in a sense reconciling what you have. In the process of restoration of a relationship, there is a tremendous amount of reconciliation that goes on, yes. Yet when we're in relationship with anybody, whether it be a workmate or something, we're going through this process. And when we go up here and we reconcile, we define what the relationship is, what it will be. By the way, up here is often when we begin to throw in those extra pennies that I talked about earlier. How do you trust somebody? Well, you give them a penny, and if they're faithful with that, then you give them another or a nickel. And this is where you either, in a sense, give pennies or take pennies away. Okay? Notice, you give or take. And this whole process is a process of discovering what the relationship is or will be. This is not a process by which you throw people away. It is a process by which you build a healthy relationship. The releasing the offense is paramount to defining. Within a divorce relationship, conflict, and then you go over here to release the offense, and for some people, they release the offense and they say, fine, I can talk to this person whenever I want, or whenever they want to talk to me. Part of the defining process is saying there's times when I can and can't. A lot of you have said primarily the only contact we have is over the children. Then it needs to stick with the children, not with how are you doing today. That needs to be a defining. As they hold the pennies of the children and you grow in that, then maybe you can test other boundaries, test other things. But the important thing in here, let me see if I get the right color. Yeah. What happens, this boundary needs to be expressed. I was in a counseling situation yesterday and I asked this man, and he has a slight handicap that you wouldn't know. And I said, he goes to this meeting, because of this handicap, he can't hear very well. He can't hear very well. And he goes to this meeting and he always sits in the farthest chair away from the meeting. And he can't hear what's going on. He has 60% hearing loss in one ear and 40% in the other. And I encouraged him to sit up in front. So he sat up in front. What ends up happening is a lot of times he looks indifferent. But it's really, he can't hear. So then I said, do the people there know about this handicap? And he says, well, I guess they do. I said, did you ever tell them? He said, no. He said, but I think they know. Well, how would they know if you don't tell them? Well, I don't know. And this needs to be an expression, not an expression just by standing there, but often a way of stating it verbally. What happens when you don't express a boundary? Verbally. What's that? Well, the boundary will break. Right. You haven't expressed the boundary. So if you can't, and it will get broken, and what ends up happening is that there's self-conflict. What also ends up happening is that you don't have the right to express or to release the offense because nothing's happened. If you haven't expressed the boundary and it's been broken, then you don't have the right to be mad about it, do you? I mean, that's what they'll say to you, right? So what ends up happening is you end up going this way. Instead of releasing the offense, you move into anger. Whoops. And then you move into resentment. Then you move into bitterness, and then you move into a boundary, another limit. Problem is you never move up here. You stay stuck down there in that circle. You end up getting stuck in this other circle because you're not expressing. So let's say you've lived down here in this circle for 10 years. Many of us have had that problem. We've either been in a relationship where we couldn't express boundaries or limits, so we get stuck down here. And by the way, when people say to me, well, I don't have any boundaries, that in itself is a huge boundary. When people express to me, I have no expectation, that's a huge expectation. So then, finally you say, I'm going to break out of this. So I'm going to make a boundary, express it. Then it moves into conflict, and this conflict gets huge. Because what ends up happening is this circle down here, that circle down there that you've been involved in, that you have been doing, it is now imputed to the other person. They now take over possession of that other circle that's happening because you've never expressed boundaries for 10 years, and all of a sudden you start doing it, and then all of a sudden they're saying, wait a minute. So they get angry, they get resentment, they get bitterness, and they move up into that. So that's why, as you're making new relationships today, I encourage you to do this as often as possible. The other ones might be a little bit tumultuous, but I also encourage you to stay in here and begin resolving, begin releasing the offense, begin defining what the relationship will be. Often this, by the way, if you've never had boundaries and you move into something like this, you will often be moving away from a lot of relationships. I see a lot of heads shaking. Yes. You will often move away because many of those relationships were abusive. Or you were abusive in them too. Okay, one more little progression here is we're going to look at this for a minute. When you set a boundary or a limit, or you make a statement about what's in your yard, you end up having to do a couple things. First, you need to, as we said, you express the boundary. This is good example is if someone calls who's an ex-spouse calls, and within 5 minutes they start berating you over the phone, calling you all sorts of names. So you make a statement like, I won't let you do this. Okay? So, fine, you express it. What else do you need to do? Any idea? Go ahead. Well, we'll hear first. Go ahead. Were you going to say something? Edith? Yeah. Okay, hang up the phone. Okay. But I would also express the consequences if they don't. See, because what happens if you just hang up the phone, they don't know you're going to do it. You haven't warned them. You've told them the boundary, but you didn't define what would happen if they break it. See, this defining process ends up going into here, and you express the boundary, then you express the consequences. If you continue to do this, either this call or the next call, I will hang up. And then if you keep calling, I will hang up, and then I will not answer the phone. Okay? So fine, you express the boundary, you express the consequences, then what do you need to do? Anyone? Act on it. Yes? Well, I like to use a different word. Stand. It says in Ephesians, it talks about the armor of God and all this other stuff, and then it has an interesting statement. Paul writes, when you have done all you can to stand, stand! That's all it says. When you've done all you can to stand, stand. So not only do you express the boundary and expect the consequences, but then you need to make the stand. Okay? Then what do you do? There's another step after that. Anyone know? Do a little brainstorming here. When you've done all you can to stand, you stand. And then what else do you do? This is a hard one. What's the one thing you don't want to do? Stuff it. accountability. In other words, when you've done all you can to stand, don't stand by yourself. Stand with God, straight and true. Have others around you, because otherwise you'll end up stuffing it. Stuffing the emotions, because when you set a boundary or something, you're not. So then, one of the keys for a boundary is to have outside support. Now, what does this have to do with forgiveness? If you remove this little part out of here, when you move from conflict to defining, it's very difficult to move from conflict into defining the relationship if you don't. The releasing of the offense identifies the hurt, identifies the pain, identifies the offense. When you move from conflict to defining, what you end up doing is moving from a conflict to generally no relationship, or allowing the relationship to continue the way it has been. Yes. Forgiveness will define the hurt. Think about it. In order to forgive, you need to know what to forgive, right? If you don't have the forgiveness in there, if you releasing the offense, you move directly from conflict to defining the relationship, which will end up defining the relationship based upon transient emotions and pain, instead of the facts. What will often, and this is where it changes. If I go from here to here and I don't go through releasing the offense, I could rely upon only one emotion, and that is, I really love them so much, so I need to forgive. I need to let them continue. Or else I'm scared of them leaving me, so therefore I will define that they can do anything they want in my life. You see what I mean? You base everything upon the strong emotions that are there. This, when you release the offense, do you know what you end up doing? You allow the Holy Spirit to begin to work in your life too. Releasing the offense brings in other people into your life. Releasing the offense allows God to come into your life. Now, I see some people struggling with this. And the only reason why Alan has sat through this illustration, I don't know how many times, and he's saying, wait, Richard, you never shared this before. Because this is something that I just recently realized, is that if you remove this part out of here, you end up going from conflict into defining based solely upon emotions. Yeah. Sure? Without moving through forgiveness. Continue. With forgiveness, yes. Forgiveness. Right. I want the relationship to continue, so I refuse to move into possibly a healthy, and it gets very confusing, doesn't it? The word that came in the back of my mind, it gets very sick. And that's why forgiveness or releasing the offense, because what often ends up, okay, let's say you don't put releasing the offense in there. If you don't forgive, now I made a statement about then you end up going into defining based solely on emotions, or you go into defining based solely upon intellectual exercise. You don't bring any of the Spirit in there. And this is what I believe with RET is we end up going from here to here, based solely upon rational emotive therapy. We basically go into defining the relationship very cold. God has brought you and has created you as a being, as a person, as an individual, as a very valuable person who is made up of a conglomerate of many different things: body, soul, spirit, emotions, intellect, spirit. And forgiveness allows you to bring all of those into the defining of the relationship. And Alan, I would hope that you wrote that down so that I can get it back to, because that's something new that I've just recently. Now you're saying, Richard, you were going to talk about forgiveness and you got in this whole circle of things. So how does this relate to everything? This is a commitment. This is not always easy. This can be the most difficult thing you've done in your life. This is also the way God talks and relates to you. God gives us principles that we're to live by, and there's conflict and there's sin. And God goes into that. In the Old Testament, when Israel would end up grumbling and everything, you would hear God respond very emotionally. Stiff-necked people, I'm going to kill every one of them little turkeys. I'm going to make them wander around in the wilderness, and I'm going to bury them under big rocks alive. I didn't quite say that, but I added that. And then Moses would argue a little bit with God and talk with God, and God would move. In a sense, Moses became the mediator between Israel and God. And that's why we need Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ is in there in this process and has offered. It is through Jesus coming and His death that we are offered forgiveness. But forgiveness does not take away the consequences, does it? That's why over here, the hardest thing you will struggle with is you will state your boundaries, you will express the boundaries, you will express the consequences, but you will generally struggle with standing by the consequences. Because that will cause turmoil. I see some faces even right now. Yet you will be, when you have done all you can to stand, you do not stand by yourself. There's not one person. There, in a sense, is not two. There is three. I say three because there is you. And I'm going back to the scripture verse in Ephesians that talks about putting on the whole armor of God. You have the armor, and then you have God. It's not the armor of your brother or your sister. It's the armor of God. I like to call the armor is often the people God gives us. We do have the armor of the helmet of salvation. We have the breastplate of righteousness. We have the shoes of salvation, is it? I think sometimes I get those all goofed up. And God also gives us a different armor. Sometimes we run into situations that we really don't need to be in. Especially in our justice system, sometimes we feel like we need to be our own lawyers when we've hired one who's charging us thousands of dollars, right? And not only that, is trying to find ways of charging more. And I'm not getting on lawyers. There's a legal secretary in here, so I have to watch out. Not really. She'll agree with me on that one. And that we are never left as orphans. Now, what happens if you make the wrong boundary? Then go through this with yourself. Go through this with yourself. Work on the real wheel of a relationship with yourself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so once... Right. Or you made the wrong boundary. Right. Which you end up going down here. So releasing yourself after the conflict if you've made an erroneous or a bad boundary or a unhealthy boundary, or even finding out, see, what often happens is we'll set up a boundary that really the relationship is either more mature. It might be too mature for that boundary. Any of you have kids? I have kids who it seems like are still 5, but she's 17 now. And some of the boundaries that I have, boundary recently was she doesn't want to come in at 1 o'clock or at midnight anymore during the summer. I want to be up till like 3 or 4. I feel like 3 or 4 is not a good boundary. Now 9 o'clock is a bad boundary for her. She didn't like that one. That was last year that we finally moved away from that one. And I didn't know about that, but then I sought the counsel of others here. The first counsel, as I saw it, is I called up the police department, asked them if there's a curfew in the town. Curfew is at 11 o'clock for her. So she's out already an hour past curfew. So I feel like that's fair. Next year, she's 18. 9 months from now, my baby will be 18. No. And she'll move on. And there's a maturing. There's also the process of maybe you get into here and you find out that you need the boundaries farther away. Well, then you need to move here and into here. This process is one that you will work with for the rest of your life, and it is a process you have been involved in all of your life. So then a person often says, how do I release the offense? Well, I'm just going to make a couple statements, and then I'm going to ask you to briefly share with me what you do to release the offense. And when you do share that, I encourage you to be somewhat short because I want to get it on tape. We're on tape right now. And what it is, you'll share it, and then I'll share it back into the microphone. To release the offense, you need to, first of all, allow people to be accountable and responsible. It's impossible to release the offense if you don't allow them to take responsibility for what they've done. Or allow them to be accountable for what they've done. What do I mean by that? Does the word codependency come up here at all? Is when we, and it's a word of the 90s, codependency and dysfunctional, they're the new words of the 90s. And when we try to release people, we try to release them from the accountability and the responsibility. And what we end up doing is voiding any kind of forgiveness or releasing of the offense that we can do. Releasing the offense basically says that they have done this or I have done this, and I will place the responsibility and the accountability upon them or me. And in placing that responsibility upon them or me, it means that I need and they need to live with it. Thirdly, we need to, now this is going to sound somewhat like a cliche, we need to give them or me to God. I cannot ever in my life do an adequate job of forgiving or releasing the offense. I cannot. That's why I need something that is bigger than me. Many of us we've been involved in habits or patterns in our life where they're bigger than us. There's an Old Testament scripture that says God will visit the judgment upon the third and fourth generation. One thing I'm going to tell you right here is I know you find this hard to believe, but I have a hard time sharing my feelings. I always did. Some people said, well, it doesn't sound like who's still alive, who's 99, I think. She has that problem too. Here I am, a 39-year-old person, and my problem is 99 years old. It's bigger than I am. Yet God is bigger than all that. So if I do not give them or give me to God, then I cannot ever get the power or the spiritual power to allow the releasing of the offense or the forgiveness to take place. Fourth, and this is somewhat circular in statement, is always realizing that releasing the offense deals with the offense alone. It does not deal with the accountability or the responsibility. Now that's somewhat circular because what I said earlier is you need to allow them to be accountable and them to be responsible. But then in step 4, after you give it to God, is you end up needing to realizing that as you forgive, it doesn't mean that you, in a sense, or that it is forgotten in their lives and in yours. The fifth thing, now these are hard, it is a daily, sometimes hourly decision. Forgiveness is not often one of those things that you feel in the beginning. It is a decision. It is a decision. Now, then I want to take all this, and by the way, I like to say here, you don't have to write down 6, but I often say that forgiveness is when we become the most like God, so it's the time that we need God the most. Because for you and me, being involved in these earthly shells and the earthly desires, forgiveness is something I need a whole lot of help from. So I guess I'm going to use this word. I'm going to move this word down to here. The difference. Let them be accountable. Help others, or let others help you to be accountable to this releasing of the offense. Then take all of these steps and carry them over into defining the relationship. When we release the offense, we do not say, okay, I've gone from this stage, now I move into this stage, and I forget everything else I've done beforehand. Do you realize that each one of these steps, when we're in the circle of a relationship, that each one of these builds out of the last one? That it is out of you make a boundary and the conflict results because of the boundary. Releasing the offense needs to be worked on because of the conflict. When you go out to defining the relationship, you have to know what the boundary was, what the conflict was, and have you released it in order to move on to setting another limit or boundary. Now this I have been working on for about 3 years. And today I just added another one. This is different than when I spoke in July. There's that one part that I moved up in there, wasn't there? Yeah? I'm probably going to still be working that one out. So don't go from here today and say, okay, I got it all together now. That's why where you were last night, I need to forgive, and I don't know how. Well, realize that process is going on. If you realize this process, because what we often say is that I can't forgive because now I don't know what to do. If I forgive, what does it mean in the relationship? Well, it means you reconcile, define what the relationship is. To move from here to here then makes it easier than just say, okay, what I have to move on to is forgiveness, and then I have to live in forgiveness, and we do have to live in forgiveness, so forgiveness wipes out everything. Forgiveness does not wipe out the fact that you and I are sinners. You know that? It makes us holy and righteous in the eyes of God, forgiveness. But no one is righteous, no, not one. So often when I speak at places, I will speak at places and they will end up giving me this glowing little introduction. And I'm up there going, where's this guy? I want to meet him. And for me, I often have to say, I get up into the pulpit or speak and I say, they forgot one accomplishment. Yes, I've done this, yes, I've done that, but they've forgotten that I am a sinner saved by grace. That's the one accomplishment I need to rest on the most, because I can easily believe what you'll say about me. And after a while, I'll really believe it, and I think I'm hot stuff. Yet I realized about 6 years ago, we're all hot stuff. We're all very special and valuable. So at this time, I'm going to shut off the mic, and if there's any questions. It's going to be some days when you cannot face them. A friend of mine who calls me from time to time says, I'm at work and I'm feeling a lot of pain, but I need to face my job right now. I need to get through this. And one of the reasons why I'm calling is to be able to do two things. One, to be able to face work, but also to be held accountable to you that I won't just drop this. So when we face the pain, often the facing pain, as I was talking to one lady on the break, is that when you give your heart to God, it's kind of like, I pointed to her purse, it's just like you saying, I give my purse to God. I give my heart to God. And God says, fine, what's in it? And you say, well, you know what's in it. Just go ahead and take it out. God says, no, I want you to take it out and hold it up to me. That's why I like the book, Hind's Feet on High Places. Because throughout the book, Much Afraid has to build little altars and place little portions of her heart on it. And it's a neat little way. And in a sense, you have to hold it and say, God, here it is. And some of it might be, God, here's my children. In the book that's offered back there by A.W. Tozer, The Pursuit of God, there's a chapter in there called The Blessedness of Having Nothing. And you can't tell by reading the chapter, but it says in the preface that chapter was written as A.W. Tozer was trying to give his daughter, who was rather rebellious, to God. And out of that, he wrote this article on the blessedness of having nothing. And are these things a struggle? Yes, they are. But is there hope? Yes, there is. Is there healing? Yes, there is. Last night I talked about that even if a person is 5% responsible for the destruction of their marriage, they're 100% responsible for the 5%. Something that someone also talked to me earlier, they said, when they got to the actual divorce, they didn't have any grief. And I like to say then that, how long were you married? And they'll maybe say 10 years. And I said, did you start at 5 years grieving? And they go, yeah. Matter of fact, for some people I've talked with, they started the day they were married. Even though the marriage might have lasted 20 years. So that often when you come to the actual nails in the coffin at the end, there isn't that huge grief, but there is also a going on, because even out of that process, you might take a lot of anger, you might take resentment, you might take the fact of it was all their fault, not realizing that every relationship has been destroyed not because of one person, but because of two people. What we end up doing often is when we, as we're trying to move on, is moving beyond blame. One of the ways we bind ourselves and keep us from moving on is by trying to fix blame somewhere. Someone once wrote, admitting your mistakes is a virtue only, or second only to making no mistakes. And none of us will ever not make mistakes. And admitting your mistakes is a virtue that we all need. What do you do if you live or you're around people who never admit their mistakes? That still doesn't void you from admitting yours. And with the blame game, what we often try to do is we try to release ourselves or someone else from responsibility. We try running around, who's to blame, who's to blame? And we do the blame game. This is where we often get into the gods, those little gods again, if and when. If this only happened, when this happened, if they only hadn't have done this. And we often try to fix the blame, maybe to make ourselves feel better, but also to avoid pain. To avoid pain. We can often blame God. I often struggle with this because I said, if God was really God, why did He allow this to happen to me? I mean, I went from managing meat departments in grocery stores for 12 years, making $40,000 a year, and I went into the ministry, and I have yet to make more than $17,000. And I say, well, but that's great. I serve God, and God does meet my needs. And then when it happened to me, when my wife left me when I was pastoring a church, I'm saying, God, don't you realize that I've served you all these years? And then I have a tendency to blame God, and we talked earlier about the fact of, why do good things or bad things happen to good people, and is it from God or is it from Satan? And what really happens is that we must be able to allow ourselves to struggle with God. If you're thinking it, if the feeling is there way in the background, you need to voice it to God. If you feel like God's to blame, I encourage you to talk with God about it. If you have trouble, take a chair. This sounds silly. Take a chair, sit in it, take another chair on the other side of you and talk to God. Just like you would another person. And begin to converse with God. If you get mad, let yourself get mad. I like to say that I often blame God for the fact that He gave everybody a willingness to choose. Wouldn't it be a whole lot easier if you just made us little robots? I'd be a lot happier, maybe. No, you wouldn't. God is a God of new beginnings. We also like to blame others. You know what you did wrong. But if only other people could admit what they did wrong. I remember sitting at home after my divorce. Sitting at home and sitting there angry and I did not want the divorce. I didn't even know it was coming. And so angry, and I remember sitting at home going, I'll show her. I'm going to stay at home. I'm going to be so mad. I'm going to be so angry. I'm going to be so bitter. I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to be so mad and see how much she'll suffer. And boy, was she suffering, right? No, who was suffering? Me. When you sit at home, and I find that is very intriguing because the one, or for me at least, the one who really didn't want it was the one who was trying to make sure the other person got what they deserved, their blame, and part of the process of putting that blame onto them was trying to destroy me, was attempting to destroy me. We get so caught up in blame that we end up forgetting the fact that there is grace in our life and we can move on. Part of the blame, or getting into the blame game, is trying to keep from moving on to forgiveness. And last night you talked about moving on to forgiveness. And why do we need to forgive? We need to forgive in order to move on. In order to move on. Last night I said, when we forgive, we can move on. And when we or other people repent, then we can love again. And what do we do if they don't repent? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. If they don't admit what there happened. And remember that if someone admits what they said or what they did, it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is going to go back to the same spot. I did not say this earlier, but I did want to say is part of the thing that often short-circuits the grief process is that when people hold out for reconciliation of their marriage, for restoration of their marriage, and if you are holding out for the restoration of your marriage, I will stand by you in that. The important thing is, though, is that if you're holding out for the restoration of your marriage, you still need to grieve. This is what often is not taught when we talk about holding out for restoration of a marriage, is we don't tell the people to grieve. What ends up happening is they might get back together, but no one's grieved. There's all this anger, this bitterness, and all this stuff coming in, and it's all been buried, and it all comes out again. It all comes out again. Far too many people who do get back together will get divorced again if they don't deal with their grief. So if you're looking to hold on to restoration of your marriage, I will stand by you on that. Here with this seminar and others, we do not advocate divorce. We do not advocate remarriage, but we do advocate healing from what's happened. Yet go through your grief process. We need to forgive because we need to move on. We need to forgive in order to release hate. Hate is a normal response to deep, unfair pain. It is instinctive. One part of you loves and the other part hates. I mean, it's just the love that draws you together exists with a hate that wants to push apart. And the hate is a response to the deep, unfair pain. What is the opposite of love? What? Apathy is the opposite of love. We often think hate is. But hate is often a emotion that is connected with deep caring. Apathy or indifference is the opposite of love. So why do we need to forgive? Because Because what ends up happening when the deep, unfair pain happens, we instinctively respond with a strong emotion that is deeper and larger than anger or mad. We need to forgive in order to understand and come out from under confusion. And the deeper the hurt, the more confusion there is. Now, at this point, I'd like to say, what does unforgiveness do? And in a minute, I'm going to define for you what I mean by forgiveness. But unforgiveness affects you physically, mentally, emotionally, everything. It affects every part of you. Secondly, it causes more hurt to you. The true victim of unforgiveness is you. And this is one thing that I want to say. The third thing is, unforgiveness grants immortality to your hurts. They become immortal. They never die. They become immortal. Now, for the purposes of today, I'm going to define forgiveness as this statement. And remember, I'm terrible at spelling. I'm just going to be releasing the offense. I am talking about an inward work that is done inside of you to release the offense that was happened. It doesn't mean it's an inward work that is done inside in order to let the relationship continue the way it was. You hear that? It's an inward work that is done to release the offense so you can move on. Forgiveness is not trust. You need to hear that. Forgiveness is not trust. Forgiveness focuses on what people do, not who they are. Trust is earned and forgiveness is granted by decision. And it's important to realize that when you move on and you begin to forgive, it doesn't mean you say what they did is all right and that they can have complete reign over your whole life. Things can just go back to the way it was. That is not forgiveness. That is stupidity. And it's when we come to God and we ask God for forgiveness, and we say, Lord, I am a sinner, come into my life, make me whole. God will come into our life. Does God trust us? Well, let me put it this way. God knows that if left to your own devices, you will continue to sin again. That's why He has given us the Scriptures. That's why He has given us the church, in order to support us and help us to grow. What's the word? Grow in grace. To grow in grace and forgiveness. Or as it says in Philippians, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And part of the thing is God realizes that, yes, we can begin to be trusted, but there's certain areas of our life. How many of you have secret sins that no one knows about? What? Now I know. No. You have secret sins that things that you have a tendency. I remember I was talking with a bunch of women one time, and we were talking about the scripture verse that even the dog will return to his vomit, and we were talking about sin and that, and we had a Freudian slip happen in the middle because we were talking about sin. You'll keep going back to it. The woman said, "Yes, and even the men will always return to their vomit." And I'm like, "No, that's not the scripture verse." But it was very Freudian. She had a real problem with men. Real big problem with men. And if left to our own devices, we will go back. We have what I like to call secret or pet sins. They're like on a leash. And so a lot of times we have a real long leash like this cord on here. But when we get to a certain point, it might be when we reach a point of stress in our lives. Often it's when we reach a point of stress. I know for me, there's this one aspect in my life whenever I start feeling, when things start getting real successful for me and a lot of neat things going on, I'm starting to feel stressed, and then I start pulling that old leash in. Because it's like things are too good to be true. And for all of us, we have what I call secret or pet sins that people don't know about, and when we get to a certain point of frustration or stress or whatever, we have a tendency to pull in the leash. How do you overcome secret sins? You bring them to light. You begin sharing them with one person. Now, you got to be real careful, because some of those, for me, two of my secret sins in the past were really big ones. They weren't that big, but to me they were. And once I was able to share them with somebody and get some accountability, I was able to move on. I was able to reel in that leash less and less. And the reason why I'm sharing this is that when it comes to trust, we need to remember that certain things we will be left to do again, or others will. And God realizes this with us, and that's why He gives us the community in order to begin working on trust. If I was an alcoholic and I had I have a drinking problem, let's say I did, and I have fallen a number of times, and let's say by any chance you had, and I know you don't, but let's say you have a 6-pack of beer and you say, Richard, will you hold on to this? Would you do that? Why not? Why not? Temptation? Because I can't be trusted, right? So then people often ask me, well, how far can I trust this person? And it's a simple little answer. As far as you can trust them. Many of us know what we can trust people with, and then we end up giving them more than we know they can be trusted with. So there's a thing that really I struggle with in there, is if I know I can't trust this person, yet I keep flogging myself by doing it, who's the one with a problem? Both of us. Yeah. And it might be that Messiah part in me saying, well, I gotta help them work on this trust issue so that they can overcome this. And see, God with us, God knows how far He can trust us. God does stretch us, because God knows we can go a little bit further. And that's part of the process of trusting, is that if a person gets to a point where we can't trust them anymore, we have to check it out from time to time. But forgiveness does not mean trust. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. This is one we always struggle with. If we could forget, then we wouldn't need to forgive. Do you know that? I have a saying that if forgiveness was forgetting, then Jesus Christ never had to come, because if anybody could forget, God could, right? Because God is God. But we only forget two things. We can only forget two types of hurts. Those that are too trivial to bother with or to remember. I stubbed my toe when I was in 7th grade on the coffee table, and it hurt a lot. I don't remember that. The ones that are too trivial to remember. The second ones that we, in a sense, forgive are those that are too horrible for the mind to remember. And the pains that we dare not remember are the ones that keep coming back disguised. So even the huge ones, with people who have been sexually abused, they often don't remember. They forgot. But it's still there. They're too horrible to remember, and when they do remember, it's awful. And they often have to get to the point of holding that hurt to give it to God. But they don't forget it. It's still there. It's disguised. Forgiveness gives us the freedom and the power to forget. Yet we often don't forget. Why? So that we don't repeat. Now it's true. Remember what it says in Scripture. It says in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, as far as the east is from the west, God removes our sin and does not remember them. And I often like to say there's a difference between not remembering and forgetting. Sometimes I forget. Sometimes I just don't remember. Sometimes I forget or I don't remember, but I do not forget the pain it caused me. And a lot of that is instinctive. You'll go into a same situation and you'll, in a sense, not remember the situation, but you'll get a physical knot in your stomach or something. Whoa, it feels like I've been here before. And in a sense, you remember things that are tied with that. Forgiveness is not evening the score. Often we think that forgiveness is evening the score. And when I became a new Christian, I was one of those ones who talked about the Lord day in and day out, and that was great, but I was really a burr in a lot of people's saddle. And, as a matter of fact, there got to a point where I was extremely self-righteous, and I would go to people, I'd do something wrong, and I'd go to them and I'd say, please forgive me. And this is what I would say sometimes is, forgive me, and I know you're still mad at me, but if you don't forgive me, then it's not my problem, it's yours. You have to deal with that. I've done my part, now it's up to you. You realize how self-righteous that is? And in a sense, what I was doing was going to them and asking for forgiveness in order to even the score. But what was happening is I was putting more points on my side, and it was really, in a sense, binding me. Forgiveness takes time. It takes a lot of time. I had a woman who say, I forgive my husband for whatever he did, whatever he's doing today, and whatever he will do in the future, I forgive him. Gosh, that gives him a shooting license, doesn't it? Completely forgets about the fact when we come into a relationship with God, God forgives us, forgives our past, forgives our present situation, but also tells us we must live and grow in grace. I am sanctified, made holy, and I am being made holy. It doesn't say I am sanctified and holy, and now I can do whatever I want. Some denominations even today say there comes a point in your life where you will never ever sin again. Never. I've often talk with those people and say, well, what happens when you do that? Well, I'm not sinning, they're just taking it wrong. You mean you took their money? Yeah, but I have wants and needs. And God blessed me with it. And forgiveness is stringless. Forgiveness, expecting people to change with strings attached, is not true forgiveness. It is manipulation. I'll repeat that. Is when you forgive people expecting them to change, it is not forgiveness. It is manipulation. I always hope that people will change. But today, right now, I'm talking about, when I define forgiveness for us today, notice how I'm making a very specific statement. For us today, and within the realm of a divorce situation, I'm talking about forgiveness as releasing the offense. It is an inward work that is done that ends up helping you to move on. And at this point, what I'm